There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. They don't come with fanfare or warning signs posted on the road ahead. They simply arrive, quietly, the way snow falls on a still morning, softly, without permission, and they change everything. This is one of those moments, and if you'll walk with me for a little while, I'd like to tell you about it. It was a Tuesday in late November, the kind of Tuesday that feels heavy before you even open your eyes. The sky over the small town of Millhaven, Pennsylvania, was the color of old pewter, low and flat, pressing down on the rooftops like a hand that had forgotten how to be gentle. Sandra Kelly was 34 years old, though she would have told you herself that she felt closer to 54 on most mornings. She had brown hair that she hadn't had time to properly brush that day. She wore a tan canvas jacket, the kind with a fleece lining that had long since flattened from too many washes, and underneath it layers that she'd chosen more for warmth than anything else. She had the kind of face that had once smiled easily and often, and still could. But these days, the smile took a little longer to arrive. On her left sat her daughter, Lily, 7 years old, thin as a reed, with wide brown eyes that noticed everything and said very little. She had her mother's coloring and her late father's quiet steadiness. She wore a purple sweater with a small embroidered flower near the collar, a sweater that was clean, because Sandra always made sure the girls were clean, even when everything else was falling apart. On her right was Gracie, 5 years old, rounder in the cheeks than her sister, with eyes that caught light the way creek water does on a summer afternoon. Gracie was the one who asked questions out loud that Lily only asked in her heart. That was simply who they were. Two sides of the same quiet coin. The three of them were seated in a corner booth at Patty's Diner, a place that had been on the corner of Route 9 and Elm for longer than most people in Millhaven could remember. It had red vinyl seats, worn soft over decades of use. The kind of place where the coffee was strong and the portions were generous and the pie under the glass dome on the counter had been turning slowly since before lunch. Sandra had her hands folded on the table in front of her. Not folded in prayer, exactly, but close enough that it might have looked that way from across the room. She was counting. Not out loud, inside, the way mothers learn to count, quietly, constantly, tallying what's left against what's needed, running the math of survival in the back of her mind even while she smiled at her daughters and asked if they wanted hot chocolate. The answer, of course, was yes. The answer was always yes. She hadn't planned to stop at Patty's that afternoon. She had been driving back from the county office on the far side of town, where she'd spent 2 hours filling out paperwork for assistance she wasn't sure she qualified for, sitting under fluorescent lights in a waiting room with plastic chairs and a television mounted too high on the wall playing a game show with the volume too loud. She had done it without complaint. She had done it with her chin up and her name signed clearly on every line, and her documents organized in a folder she'd bought at the dollar store specifically for this purpose. She was not a woman who accepted defeat easily. But when she pulled out of that parking lot and turned onto Route 9, the girls had been in the back seat for 4 hours, and Gracie had said something so small, so simply and honestly, that Sandra had pulled the car to the side of the road and sat there for a full minute before she could breathe properly again. Gracie had said, in that straightforward way that only 5-year-olds manage, she had said, "Mommy, if we eat today, will we starve tomorrow?" She hadn't meant it as a knife, she'd meant it as a question, the way children do, honest and clean and completely without artifice. But it had landed in Sandra's chest like something she would carry for a long time. She'd looked in the rearview mirror at those two small faces, Lily watching her carefully, already understanding more than she should have to. Gracie waiting with her patient, open expression for an answer that made sense. And Sandra had said, "No, baby, we are not going to starve." And then she had looked ahead at the road, and she had spotted the yellow sign for Patty's Diner glowing softly in the gray afternoon light, and she had thought, "We are going to stop. We are going to sit down. We are going to have something warm. And I will figure out the rest later." Because that is what you do. You take the next step. You keep the girls warm. You keep going. She had $11 and some change in her wallet. She pulled in. Patty's was busier than she expected for a Tuesday afternoon. She noticed them right away, as you would. It would have been difficult not to. There were 8 of them, maybe 9, spread across the far end of the diner in a way that filled the space without crowding it. Large men, most of them. Men who had clearly spent decades outdoors, in weather, on roads that didn't always cooperate. They wore leather vests over their jackets, the kind with patches sewn on in careful rows, and some wore bandanas, and one near the window wore a cap pulled low over a face that had seen considerable mileage. They were loud in the way that a group of old friends is loud, not aggressive, just present, filling the room with the easy noise of people who have known each other through hard years and good ones alike. Sandra settled the girls into the corner booth, away from the noise, against the window, and she picked up the laminated menu, and she looked at the prices with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this kind of arithmetic for months. Hot chocolates for the girls. She would have coffee. Maybe split a plate of eggs and toast with Lily, cut Gracie's portion from her own. Work it out. She always worked it out. Lily was looking at the menu with her careful brown eyes. Gracie was watching the bikers. Children have no pretense about them. They look at what they want to look at, and Gracie was looking at the big men with the patches on their vests with a calm and open curiosity that held no fear whatsoever. One of the men noticed. He was sitting at the far table, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his mid-50s, with a silver-streaked beard and hands that looked like they'd been built for heavy work. He had a face that was weathered in a way that spoke of years rather than age. Deep lines around the eyes from squinting into wind and road, a jaw that was square and set, eyes that were surprisingly soft. He was the one the red arrow might have pointed to, if life came with arrows. His name was Raymond Cross. His friends called him Ray. He had been a Hell's Angel for 31 years. He had ridden more miles than he could count across more states than most people visit in a lifetime. He had sat with dying friends and celebrated new babies and carried coffins and toasted at weddings and done everything in between. He had lived, as they say, with full volume. And in all of that living, he had learned something that he never said out loud but that guided him as reliably as a compass guides a ship. He had learned that kindness is never wasted, not once, not ever. Ray watched the small girl watching him. He watched the mother's hands, folded on the table, knuckles slightly pale, the posture of someone holding something together through sheer will. He had known that posture. He had seen it on his own mother's hands when he was young, back in a time when things were tight, and pride was sometimes the only currency left in the house. He knew what he was looking at. He turned back to his coffee, but his mind stayed at that corner booth. The waitress came. Her name was Deb, 50-something, cheerful in the reliable way of women who have been doing this work for years and genuinely like it. She took Sandra's order without ceremony and brought the hot chocolates quickly, and Gracie wrapped both small hands around the mug with an expression of pure and uncomplicated happiness that made something loosen slightly in Sandra's chest. This, Sandra thought. This is enough. Right now. This is enough. She listened to Lily tell her something about a book she'd been reading at school, something about horses. Lily loved horses with a devotion that bordered on spiritual. Sandra listened and nodded and felt, for a moment, like herself again. The eggs came. She divided them carefully. She drank her coffee slowly, making it last. And then something changed in the room. She felt it before she saw it, the slight shift in the ambient sound of the diner, the way conversations sometimes pause when something worth noticing happens. She looked up. Ray was standing at the counter, not at their table. He wasn't approaching her, wasn't making any movement toward them. He was simply standing at the counter, speaking quietly to Deb and nodding once and then returning to his seat. Deb came to their table a few minutes later. She was carrying a tray. On it were 2 plates stacked with pancakes, golden, steaming, with butter melting in slow golden rivers down the sides, a plate of bacon, another round of hot chocolate for the girls, a fresh coffee for Sandra, and a slice of pie, apple with a lattice crust, that had been cut generously, the way pie should always be cut. Sandra looked up at Deb. Deb smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't need explanation. "It's been taken care of, hun," she said simply. "Enjoy it." Sandra opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked across the diner. Ray had his back to her, his wide shoulders turned toward his own table, his attention apparently back on his friends, on the conversation she could hear rising and falling in its easy rhythm. She felt something move through her that she couldn't have named precisely. Not embarrassment, not pity, nothing diminishing. It was something older and simpler than any of those things. It was the feeling of being seen, of being held, even for a moment, by the attention of another human being who looked at her situation without judgment and simply thought, I can help, so I will. Gracie was already reaching for the bacon. Lily was looking at the pancakes with the kind of reverence that deserved a quiet moment of its own. Sandra put her hand over her mouth, just for a second. Then she squared her shoulders the way she always did, and she smiled at her daughters and said, All right, girls, let's eat. She thought about going over to thank him. She rehearsed it in her mind. The words, the approach, how she would make sure she said it right, that she conveyed what she wanted to convey without it becoming more than it was. She didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want to make him uncomfortable. She didn't want to cry in the middle of Patty's Diner on a Tuesday afternoon. She watched and waited for a moment when it might feel natural. And then the moment arrived. Ray stood, along with his friends, in the gradual way that large groups of people prepare to leave. A slow rising, a gathering of jackets, a round of laughter at something someone said. They moved toward the door in easy formation, and Ray was near the back of the group, and as he passed the corner booth where Sandra sat with her daughters, he glanced over, just briefly. Sandra looked at him, and he looked at her, and she said, quietly so only he could hear, she said, Thank you. 2 words, but she said them with everything she had. Ray stopped, just for a beat. He looked at Lily. He looked at Gracie, who looked right back at him with those wide Creekwater eyes and no fear whatsoever. And Ray, this man with 30 years of road on his face and leather on his back and a reputation that would have surprised no one and explained everything, this man smiled, a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and changes the whole landscape of a face. He said, You've got good kids there, ma'am. And then he put on his cap, and he walked out the door, and through the window Sandra watched him climb onto his motorcycle, a big black machine that rumbled to life with a sound like distant thunder, and ride away down Route 9 with his friends on either side of him, disappearing into the gray November afternoon. She sat with the girls a little longer than she needed to. She ordered 1 more coffee, just a half cup, just enough to justify staying a little while longer in the warmth. She listened to Gracie explain with great authority that the bacon at Patty's was the best bacon in the entire world. She watched Lily finish the apple pie with the careful pleasure of someone who understood, even at 7, that some things deserved to be savored. Outside, the sky had lightened slightly. Not dramatically, not the sun breaking through in a cinematic way, just lighter. The way late afternoon sometimes softens the edges of a hard day. Sandra thought about what Ray had done. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a speech or a proclamation. It was a quiet word to a waitress and the settling of a bill and a departure without expectation of acknowledgement or reward. It was the kind of kindness that asks nothing back, the rarest kind, the kind that comes from people who have lived long enough to know that the doing of it is its own reward. She thought about her own life, about the people who had helped her without making her feel small for needing help. Her aunt, years ago, who had pressed folded bills into her hand and said, "Don't mention it," in a tone that truly meant it. A neighbor once who had left groceries on the porch during a bad week with no note, no name. A teacher who had slipped Lily an extra granola bar in the fall and smiled at Sandra